It was holiday time in Cornwall and the traffic was very heavy. Suddenly there was the sound of a klaxon horn, followed by a honk-honk horn. As people turned to look, they saw the car with the two horns. It was an Austin Clifton Heavy 12-4. It was Gumdrop. Mr. Oldcastle was on holiday too. He drove to the quayside and switched off the engine. He then went down to the ferry to take him to the castle across the bay. Now, when an old vintage car is left alone, it doesn't stay that way for long. People admire it. Children touch it with sticky hands, and even other cars stop to look. The two men from this car looked all over Gumdrop. They even lifted the back seat and seemed to rummage around under it. There is no end to the curiosity of enthusiasts. At length, Mr. Oldcastle returned and drove off. They were not far up the road when a small black dog ran out. Mr. Oldcastle braked very hard and stopped with a big bang. The dog ran merrily on, but Gumdrop had a puncture. Mr. Oldcastle changed the wheel and took the punctured one to be repaired. Meanwhile, the little black dog returned, sniffed the car, jumped into the back seat and went to sleep. Mr. Oldcastle was putting the mended wheel back when someone licked his head. "Off with you," he shouted, but the dog stayed put. "Oh, I suppose we'll have to find where you live. You've caused enough trouble, you wretched, horrible dog. Horrible Horace." And Horace just wagged his tail. Mr. Oldcastle looked at the address on his collar. It read, "The Old Tin Mine, Trousseaus." Mr. Oldcastle got into the car and drove off. He asked some policemen the way. The sergeant directed them and said he would take them, but they were looking for a blue car in connection with some stolen watches. "I hope you don't mean Gumdrop," said Mr. Oldcastle. "You don't look like smugglers to us," said the sergeant. So Mr. Oldcastle searched for the Old Tin Mine. They crossed a ford and the water splashed all over Gumdrop, wetting his plugs so that his engine stopped. Mr. Oldcastle lifted the back seat to get the spare set of plugs and was astonished to find a strange parcel. Mr. Oldcastle was more astonished when he opened it. It was full of watches, 100 or more. "We must get these to the police. They must be the smuggled ones." He changed the plugs as quickly as possible and drove off. A car overtook them and stopped. Mr. Oldcastle had to stop as two men got out. "We are vintage car enthusiasts," said one. "Can we have a closer look?" Horace barked and bared his teeth. Mr. Oldcastle was polite. "I'm sorry, I don't have the time now," he said, and drove off. "We don't want people poking around Gumdrop. If they find the watches, they'll think we smuggled them." They raced off to find a police station. Suddenly, Horace barked. The car enthusiasts were waving at them to stop. "I know that Gumdrop's a beauty, but this is ridiculous," said Mr. Oldcastle. He saw a narrow lane, turned Gumdrop into it, and hid behind a thick hedge. "That's got rid of them," said Mr. Oldcastle. Just then Horace jumped out of Gumdrop and ran on down the lane. Mr. Oldcastle followed him, and there was the Old Tin Mine. Horace raced in and came out with his favourite bone. Mr. Oldcastle entered the building to look for the owner and stumbled over a large stone. Behind it was a glittering heap. There were watches, jewels, and silver and gold. "The smuggler's den," cried Mr. Oldcastle. "I shall certainly have news for the police." Just then, two cars skidded to a halt. The blue car with the vintage car enthusiasts, followed by the police car. "We wish to search your car," the sergeant said. "That's the car you're looking for," said one of the men, pointing at Gumdrop. So the policeman searched both cars and found the watches under Gumdrop's seat. "Before you arrest me," said Mr. Oldcastle calmly, "look into the tin mine which belongs to these gentlemen here." He was so polite that the sergeant did so. Mr. Oldcastle now realized what had happened. The vintage car enthusiasts were really the smugglers. They had panicked and hidden the watches in Gumdrop. Just then one smuggler grabbed the watches and they both ran, but Horace pulled one down and the constable caught the other by his collar. Meanwhile, the sergeant had found the treasure. He realized the truth and arrested the smugglers. Horace had belonged to the smugglers, but they'd cruelly turned him out. "I suggest you keep him," the sergeant said to Mr. Oldcastle. So it was how Gumdrop found a friend.